The storm raged across the arid landscape, howling winds that cut through flesh like 1,000 needles. Dust kicked up in swirling vortices, forming waves of brown and orange that seemed to devour the horizon. In the midst of it all stood a lone figure, her silhouette just barely visible through the thick veil of dust and wind. Her name was Shira, and though her clothes were tattered and her body bruised, she stood tall, unyielding against the elements. Her eyes scanned the desolate terrain as she moved, each step a calculated measure, each breath forced through the burning air. She could feel the weight of the world bearing down on her, the burden of survival gnawing at her from every direction. But Shira didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she had come so far. Her goal was simple: to survive. To escape the war, to escape the tyranny of the alien forces that had decimated her homeworld. But survival had come at a cost. A cost that had ripped away the last remnants of her humanity and left behind something raw, something desperate. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried to push it aside. And there, beyond the storm, she saw it. The faint outline of a settlement, small but solid, her salvation. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she forced herself forward. Each step brought her closer to the settlement, but also closer to something she couldn't quite name. She had been traveling for days without food, without water, and the fatigue was beginning to take its toll. The thought of the settlement's meager shelter kept her moving, the distant lights flickering like a beacon in the storm. Shira had never intended to be here. She had never expected to end up on Earth, of all places. But the ship's crash had left her stranded, and there had been no other choice but to walk. Earth wasn't what she'd expected. It wasn't the perfect, pristine haven she had hoped for, nor was it the savage, war-torn hellscape she had feared. It was something in between, something strange. And something, perhaps, worth fighting for. The wind suddenly howled louder, as if the storm itself was angry with her persistence. Her skin, already cracked and scorched from the sun, began to sting with the fury of the sandstorm. The small pack she had carried, filled with supplies from the wreckage, was nearly empty. Her thoughts wandered to her people, the others she had lost along the way, and her heart sank. She had not come this far to fail. But failure seemed inevitable now. The odds were stacked against her, and she had no plan. She only had the urge to survive, to find a way out. It was then that she heard it. A noise, distant, muffled by the howling winds, but unmistakable. A vehicle. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. Instinctively, Shira ducked behind a small ridge of rocks, her breath catching in her throat. Was it one of the soldiers from the alien faction that had torn apart her world? Were they finally catching up to her? Or was it something else, someone else? The vehicle grew louder, its engine humming beneath the storm's cacophony. And then, through the dust, she saw it, a figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in simple but well-worn armor, a helmet resting under his arm as he walked. Shira's hand instinctively went to the blaster at her side. She had nothing left to lose, nothing but her life. But before she could raise it, the man stopped, as if sensing her presence. He stood still for a moment, his gaze sweeping the area, and then he spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "You're not from around here, are you?" Shira froze, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no malice in his voice, but there was something about him, something that felt different. She had seen humans before. Their faces, their mannerisms, they were too strange, too unpredictable for her to trust. But this man, standing before her in the storm, didn't seem like one of the cold, calculating soldiers she had grown to despise. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Shira watched him carefully, trying to gauge whether he was a threat. His stance was relaxed, his hand resting casually on the handle of a weapon, but his eyes were curious, not hostile. It was the eyes of someone who had seen far too much, someone who had suffered, just like she had. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man added, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "But it looks like you're in no condition to walk much farther." Shira didn't respond. Instead, she took a step back, her eyes darting around the terrain, considering her options. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the blaster, but her instincts told her that attacking wouldn't solve anything. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then the man spoke again, this time with more certainty. "I can help you. If you want it." The words lingered in the air between them, thick with the weight of possibility. Shira felt a strange mix of emotions surge through her: suspicion, hope, and a gnawing hunger that was more than just physical. She had never trusted anyone, not in the years since her people had been scattered to the winds. But this man, this human, was offering something no one had offered her in years: a chance. A chance to survive. Her throat felt dry, and she swallowed hard before speaking. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would you help me?" The man didn't flinch. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing left." Shira looked at him, her heart pounding. There was something in his words that struck a chord deep within her, a truth she couldn't ignore. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance. Not just to survive, but to live again. But as the winds howled around them, and the darkness deepened, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something far more dangerous than either of them could understand. She needed answers. But first, she needed to survive. "I'll go with you," Shira finally said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "But I'll be watching you." The man nodded, a slight grin tugging at his lips. "Fair enough." And with that, they began their journey together, into the unknown. The wind had died down by the time they reached the settlement, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The small outpost, a collection of worn-down buildings nestled against the jagged hills, stood in stark contrast to the wild, unforgiving world that surrounded it. Shira's boots crunched against the dirt path as she walked beside the man, Marcus, as he had introduced himself, his broad figure leading the way with steady, unhurried steps. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Shira wasn't used to depending on anyone, especially not a human. Trust was a fragile thing, something she had learned to keep at arm's length. But Marcus, despite his obvious military training, exuded an aura of calm and quiet strength that she couldn't ignore. He didn't press her for details about her past, didn't ask the probing questions others might have. It was almost as if he understood without needing to be told. They passed a few locals on their way into the settlement, none of them giving much more than a passing glance. Humans were cautious, wary of outsiders, understandable, given the world they lived in. But Shira noticed the way some of them looked at Marcus. It was as if he was their protector, their savior, yet also a part of the landscape. He didn't belong to them, but neither did he appear foreign. He moved like he knew the pulse of this place, like he had lived here long enough to command its rhythms. "Where are we going?" Shira's voice broke through the stillness. She hadn't spoken much since their encounter outside, too lost in thought. But now, the need for answers gnawed at her. "Somewhere safe." Marcus's voice was low, gravelly, but his tone was reassuring. "You need rest, and we need to get off the streets before the wrong people notice you." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. She didn't trust anyone, least of all humans. Still, the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the ache in her limbs made it difficult to argue. She followed him, keeping her senses sharp, as they moved deeper into the settlement. They entered a small building at the edge of the settlement, a single-story structure that appeared worn but functional. Inside, the scent of stale bread and roasting meat filled the air, mingling with the musty aroma of old wood. A faint hum of distant conversation echoed from the corners of the room, where several humans clustered around tables, their faces either relaxed or wary. Marcus led Shira to a small cot at the back of the room, its rough blankets piled high. "You can rest here," he said, his voice softer now. "I'll make sure you're not disturbed." Shira didn't reply. She was too busy scanning the room, taking in the faces that flitted in and out of her vision. This wasn't a safe haven, it was a temporary stop on a path she didn't understand. But the weariness in her bones screamed for rest, for a moment to close her eyes without the threat of imminent danger. "Don't stay out too long," Shira finally said, her voice hoarse. "I don't trust anyone here." Marcus met her gaze, his eyes intense but understanding. "You don't have to trust them," he said. "You just need to rest. We can figure things out once you're stronger." The way he said it, struck her harder than she expected. There was something in his voice that made her hesitate, something raw and genuine that she hadn't encountered in years. For a moment, her defenses wavered, but she quickly pushed the thought aside. "I'm not weak," she replied, her tone sharp. Marcus didn't flinch, just gave her a nod before stepping back toward the door. "You never were. But even the strongest need rest." The hours that followed were disorienting. Shira found herself lying in the cot, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts raced. The room was quiet, save for the occasional clink of dishes or the faint murmur of conversation from the other side of the building. But beneath the stillness, she could feel something, him. Marcus, moving around the settlement, checking things, his presence constantly nearby. His steady, unyielding presence that felt like a quiet promise. She didn't know why she couldn't let herself relax, why her thoughts refused to slow. Maybe it was the constant need to be on alert. Or maybe it was the overwhelming feeling that, at any moment, something was going to shatter this fragile truce between them. She had been alone for so long that the idea of another person, someone who might care, or worse, someone who might betray her, was too much to comprehend. The pain of losing her people, of watching everything she knew burn to ash, still haunted her, an ache so deep she feared it would never heal. And yet, here was Marcus, offering something she couldn't quite grasp. Trust. He hadn't asked for anything in return, at least not yet. He had simply offered her a moment of respite, a brief chance to let her guard down. But trust was a currency she had long since stopped trading in. The sound of the door creaking open pulled Shira from her thoughts. She turned her head, instinctively reaching for the weapon that wasn't there. It was Marcus. His expression was unreadable as he stepped inside, his eyes briefly flicking to the cot where she lay. "Rested?" he asked, his voice a gentle challenge. Shira didn't answer immediately. She had never been one to answer questions with ease, especially not when the question was personal. But something about his tone, the way he looked at her, made her feel vulnerable in a way she couldn't explain. "I've been alone too long," she finally said, her voice quieter now. "I don't know how to be anything else." Marcus leaned against the wall, watching her closely. "You don't have to be anything you're not. Not here. Not with me." The way he said it, like a promise, like an unspoken vow, settled in her chest, heavy and uncertain. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that for once, someone wasn't going to betray her. But her past, the memories of those who had failed her, weighed heavily on her heart. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "To be hunted. To lose everything and have nothing left." Marcus took a slow step toward her, his expression softening. "I know. And I won't let that happen to you again. Not while I'm here." For a moment, Shira could only stare at him, her heart a confusing mix of gratitude and suspicion. Was he lying? Was he just like the others? Then, without another word, he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Shira was alone again, but the silence felt different now. Less oppressive. She wasn't sure if it was the storm outside or the unspoken promise Marcus had left with her, but something had changed. A shift had occurred, subtle, but undeniable. And in that moment, she realized that her battle was far from over. Trust wasn't just something she had to give, it was something she had to learn to earn. And it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Shira wasn't sure she had to fight alone anymore. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, a reminder of the endless fight to survive. Shira stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the distant horizon. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert-like landscape. It wasn't a place meant for hope, and yet, despite its harshness, there was a strange comfort in knowing that, for now, she was safe. Or at least, safer than she had been. The town was quiet, with only a few souls wandering the streets, most of them hunched over, their movements sluggish. The remnants of a once thriving human settlement, now reduced to small, isolated pockets of resistance. Shira's gaze shifted to Marcus, who was standing near the edge of the town, his broad back facing her. He was watching the horizon, too, but there was something different about the way he stood. Something tense. His posture, though still relaxed, betrayed the sharp focus in his eyes. "You've been quiet," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence. It was gruff, as usual, but there was an edge to it now, a tone that wasn't just physical exhaustion. There was something else lurking beneath the surface. He turned slightly, glancing at her over his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice carrying an uncertainty that she couldn't hide. "About everything. About this place, about you." She took a few steps toward him, her boots kicking up the dry earth beneath her. She had asked so little of him, yet he had given so much. And in return, she found herself more confused than ever. Marcus didn't answer immediately, instead shifting his gaze back to the horizon. "You're not the only one," he said after a long pause. "You're right to be cautious. This place, it's not the sanctuary you think it is." His voice dropped, a grim note threading through his words. Shira's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Marcus took a deep breath, rubbing his hand over his face. It was as if he had been carrying this burden for too long, and now, for the first time, he was willing to share it. "The people here, they're not who they seem. They've got their own agenda, and it doesn't align with mine. Or yours, for that matter." Shira frowned, stepping closer to him. "You're not making sense." "I thought," she cut herself off, realizing how foolish her assumptions had been. She had trusted him. She had been so quick to believe that Marcus, this man who had offered her shelter and safety, was an ally. Marcus turned fully to face her, his eyes shadowed with regret. "I know you thought I was trying to protect you," he said softly, his voice tinged with a pain she hadn't expected. "But the truth is, I'm no different than anyone else. I've been lying to you, just like everyone else here. You're not just a refugee. You're a target." The words hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. "A target? What the hell are you talking about?" She felt the ground beneath her sway, as if the very earth had begun to give way. Marcus's face softened, his expression apologetic, but there was no hiding the harsh truth in his eyes. "You're not just some lost alien wandering into human territory. You're a symbol of something much bigger. Something they're willing to kill for." Shira's breath came in ragged gasps as her mind raced to process what he was saying. Her mind, still tangled in the desperation of survival, couldn't quite make sense of the pieces. "Who are you really, Marcus? What are you hiding?" She took another step back, her hand reaching for the familiar, comforting weight of the weapon she had left behind in the shelter. Marcus didn't reach for his own weapon, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the horizon again. "I've been trying to protect you, in my own way. But I've made mistakes. A lot of them." He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his frustration palpable. "I didn't think they'd come for you this soon. But now, we don't have much time." Shira's pulse quickened as something unfamiliar clawed at her chest. Fear, yes, but also something darker. Betrayal. The very idea that Marcus, who had stood by her through all of this, was hiding something so crucial, something that could change everything, felt like a cruel twist of fate. "You're saying I'm a target," she whispered, almost too afraid to hear it aloud. "Who's after me?" Marcus sighed, his voice a low rasp. "I don't know exactly, but I know they're coming. You're not the only one who's been hunted, Shira. And if you think I haven't been running from something too, you're wrong." His words hung in the air between them, each one carrying the weight of something darker, something dangerous. She had been a fool to think she could outrun her past. She had been a fool to think that trust was a currency she could afford to give. The truth was, no one could be trusted. Not even him. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" The anger in her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension that had thickened between them. "I couldn't. I didn't know who you were. Not really. Marcus stepped forward, his hand held out in a gesture that might have been meant for comfort but only added to her growing fury. I'm sorry, Shira. I should have told you sooner. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the sound of the wind rustling the dry brush around them the only noise that filled the space between them. Shira felt the weight of his apology pressing down on her, but it wasn't enough. The betrayal, the lies, were too much to forgive. But then, as if sensing the shift in the air, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter now. I'm trying to fix this. We can't do it alone, but together, we might stand a chance. Shira shook her head, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. You lied to me. I don't know if I can believe anything you say anymore. Marcus's eyes were full of regret, but there was something else there, too. Something raw. I never wanted to lie to you, Shira. I didn't know how else to keep you safe. I thought I could protect you from all of this. Her gaze softened for a moment, but the sharp sting of betrayal was still too fresh, too painful. And now, she asked, her voice trembling despite herself. What happens now, Marcus? A heavy silence hung in the air as Marcus stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Now, we run. Because they'll come for us both if we don't. Shira looked at him, her heart torn between the anger she felt and the flicker of hope his words ignited. But one thing was certain, trust was no longer something she could afford. Not yet. The night had descended quickly, the sun slipping behind the jagged hills with unnatural speed, as if eager to escape the oppressive weight of the desert. Shira and Marcus stood just outside the settlement, their eyes scanning the distance, the air thick with the unspoken tension between them. They had only moments, maybe less, before the quiet would shatter into chaos. A muffled sound reached them, too far off to be anything significant, but in the silence of the night, even the smallest noise felt amplified. Shira felt her pulse quicken, her eyes darting to Marcus, who was already moving with the precision of someone accustomed to danger. We need to go, Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. The calmness in his tone seemed at odds with the underlying storm that was brewing inside him. Shira's body tensed. She had learned to trust nothing, to rely only on her instincts, and right now, every instinct screamed that they were being hunted. And worse, she had no idea who or what was chasing them. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me exactly what's happening, Marcus. Shira's voice was steady but edged with the frustration that had built ever since she had learned the truth. She was a target. And so was he. Marcus turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told a different story. He knew time was slipping away. It's not just about you, Shira. It's about both of us. He paused, taking a breath. You're not the only one they're after. Her breath caught in her throat. The revelation, though not entirely unexpected, still hit her with a force that sent a chill down her spine. Who else? She asked, the weight of his words sinking in. Me, Marcus replied, his voice raw with the honesty that only years of secrets could create. I've been running from them long before you ever crossed my path. And now they know where we are. A flicker of disbelief danced in Shira's chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, steady clarity. You've been lying to me this whole time? She asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't flinch. Not exactly. But I've been keeping the truth hidden. I had to. You wouldn't be here if you knew the whole story. Shira closed her eyes for a moment, the sting of betrayal sharper than she expected. She had trusted him more than anyone else in years, and now it felt as though every word he had said was laced with falsehoods. Yet, there was something about him, something she couldn't deny. His silence now spoke louder than his earlier explanations ever could. We don't have time for this, Marcus said, cutting through the storm of thoughts in her mind. We need to move, now. They're closing in. Shira opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. She saw the exhaustion there, the weight of someone who had carried a burden for too long. And, in the midst of the anger and betrayal that swirled inside her, a single truth cut through: he needed her. They needed each other. For reasons unknown to her, they had been thrust together, bound by something she couldn't yet name. Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was something deeper, something far more complicated than either of them were ready to admit. But there was one thing that was undeniable: she couldn't leave him now. Not when the enemy was already upon them. With a sharp nod, Shira gestured toward the distant hills. "Lead the way," she said, her voice cold but resolute. "And don't lie to me again." Marcus didn't flinch. He simply turned, his pace quickening as he moved toward the far edge of the settlement. Shira followed, her movements fluid, the weight of her past settling on her like a heavy cloak. She had been running for so long. But now, there was no escaping. The world around them was dark and quiet, save for the sounds of their footsteps and the occasional distant cry of something in the night. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, an unforgiving landscape that seemed both ominous and beautiful in its stark, desolate way. Marcus had never been a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, he glanced over his shoulder at her, his brow furrowed. "There's a safe house nearby," he said. "It's a short distance from here. But it's not exactly foolproof." Shira's eyes narrowed. "How many people know about it?" "Too many," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "That's the problem." A slight shiver ran down Shira's spine. It was one thing to be hunted by faceless enemies, but knowing that the place they were headed was compromised made her feel more exposed than ever. She had no illusions about the kind of people they were up against: dangerous, ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. And that included her. Shira slowed her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. "So, what's the plan then? We just keep running until they catch us?" Marcus stopped, turning to face her with a hardness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "We fight," he said simply. She looked at him, the weight of those words sinking in. "Fight? Against them?" She shook her head. "What chance do we have?" He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "We have each other," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "And that's enough for now." The air between them crackled with an intensity she hadn't expected. For a moment, Shira was lost in the depth of his eyes, the honesty that lingered in them, the same honesty that had been buried beneath layers of lies and secrets. It was a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to accept, but for the first time, she felt something shift. The walls she had so carefully constructed were beginning to crack. "We don't have to do this alone," Marcus continued, his voice almost a whisper. "We don't have to keep running." Shira's heart raced, the implications of his words settling deep within her. But as she looked at him, the man who had lied to her, betrayed her, and yet still stood beside her, she felt the pieces begin to fall into place. She wasn't ready to trust him, not yet. But in this moment, in this place, perhaps trust wasn't the most important thing. Together, they had a chance. And that was enough. But as they moved forward, the silence between them thickened, laden with unspoken words and unacknowledged emotions. Shira couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something that would change everything. And in the distance, just beyond the shadow of the hills, a figure emerged from the darkness, its outline faint but unmistakable. The chase was about to begin.